All right, so again, welcome everybody. This is Curator Tori. Thank you for joining us today for our Facebook Live Kids edition. Thanks for being flexible with a little bit of a later time start. Again, this is our 6th episode in our kids series that we've been doing every Tuesday at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. And we have 2 more episodes to go. So just a reminder for that, and thanks for tuning in. So like before, we'll do a quick recap of some of the other episodes if some of you guys didn't get to watch those or tune in for those. Our first episode was called Bear Hardware, and we covered teeth and claws. Some of the main points of that were that black bears are omnivores. They have 3 different main types of teeth: canines, incisors, and molars, all used for different sorts of foods. And they use their claws a lot as well for climbing and digging and getting to other food sources. Our second Facebook Live Kids video was all about a bear's nose and how amazingly well they can smell. So they can smell 7 times greater than a bloodhound. They use their great sense of smell to find each other, to find food, and to detect danger. And a bear's sense of smell is oftentimes also what gets them into trouble with people, finding garbage cans, pet food, and bird feeders. Our third episode was all about bear hair. So a couple reminders on that. Bears are mammals just like you and me. They have hair. The guard hairs are those outer hairs used for that initial protection, and the underfur is very important for insulation, especially in the winter months. And black bears can be any of up to 6 different color phases. If you guys remember, we showed you all those different color phases. So color is also not the best way to tell the difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear. Our 4th episode was all about their diet. So bears change their diets with seasons and what's available, and that's what we would call opportunistic. At ABR here, we also try to mimic this seasonal diet in a very hands-off way. And remember, do not feed bears, as a fed bear is a dead bear. And last week we went over our episode on bear denning behavior. So bears are not true hibernators. They experience what we would call a winter sleep called torpor. They do not have to den up in the winter, but do so because of food availability. And the 3 main den types that we talked about were tree cavities, excavated ground dens, and ground nests. So as always, if you guys have questions, please feel free to comment them on our comment section below. I won't be answering them as I go through our program today, but I'll make sure to come back on afterwards and get to all those questions and answer them after the program. So our episode today is called Bears, Humans, and Habitat: Multiplication and Division. And to start, we're going to go all the way back and start with some early history. About 27 million years ago, that is when the earliest undisputed bear species, called the dawn bear, lived, the Ursavis elemensis. I could be saying that completely wrong, but you might notice that first genus there, Ursavis, is very similar to the genus of our nowadays black bears, Ursus. So these were what I just said. They were called the dawn bear, and they were fox terrier sized and lived in Europe. Now we're going to go through some of the first early observations of bears. So 985 was the first observation of the American black bear, which would have been during the 10th and 11th century. Then from there's some other noteworthy encounters with early bears. 1492, sorry about that. Of course, Christopher Columbus sailed to North America's coast, where there would have been a lot of American black bears. 1602 is the first record of grizzly bears that we have from some Spanish explorers. 1804, Lewis and Clark, of course, have many records of their bear encounters, and I actually came across on my Facebook today that May 5th, in their journals, was when they came across the largest grizzly they ever saw, and May 5th is today, so I thought that fit perfectly for our presentation. And in 1940, of course, Franklin Roosevelt officially dedicated the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which would become home to a great population of black bears, as many of you know. So as you can see, bears and people have been coexisting for a very long time. And some of those first humans to admire and respect the black bears of North America specifically were the Native Americans. So here in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the Cherokee people were very comfortable living alongside our local black bear populations. The Native Americans used bears for meat, fat, and they would use their warm, heavy hides. And they were also cherished and believed to be spiritual and have healing powers like shamans. The first settlers of Tennessee, similarly to the Native Americans, did harvest bears. However, they did also fear them and see them as a threat to livestock and human safety. The bear populations did slowly begin to decline soon after settlers arrived, and extreme changes in Tennessee's habitat, along with unregulated hunting, eliminated bear populations from all but 11 counties in Tennessee. So here you can see is a historical range of the black bear in North America. So you can see in Alaska, it goes all through the Canadian provinces. All the states in the United States are covered. There are black bears in all of them. And then here is their current distribution. So it's restricted to those undisturbed forested regions in at least 40 of the 50 states, and their status in Mexico is a little bit uncertain. So a lot smaller range, but as you can imagine, a lot more people, a lot more settlers, so a lot less space for the bears. So as we mentioned earlier, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, this has to be one of the greatest protections that was ever put into place for bear populations in Tennessee, along with the Cherokee National Forest. So these are some of the greatest chunks of undisturbed land where those black bear populations can really thrive. And lastly, another great contributing factor to the wildlife populations like the black bear was Aldo Leopold's introduction to wildlife and land management. So Aldo Leopold was considered one of the most influential conservation thinkers of the 20th century. He published the first textbook in the field of wildlife management in 1933, and a Sands County Almanac, his land ethic essay, was published in 1949. And how many of you have read that? I'd love to see you comment below. If you haven't read it, I would highly encourage it. Many of you listening are active conservationists yourself, and this kind of is like the beginning Bible of land and wildlife management. So here's a quote here from Aldo. "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." So Aldo really was that first beginning of wildlife management and what it meant to preserve not only the land and wildlife, but also the people that lived alongside them. So he did help create that main definition of wildlife management today. So wildlife management attempts to balance the needs of wildlife with the needs of people using the best available science. And I really want to highlight this part, the word people here. So we are a huge part of the ecosystem, so it's also crucial that wildlife managers take people into consideration as well. And as you can imagine, the people are almost always harder to manage than the animals themselves. But as we saw earlier with European settlers, it's crucial to have management of both wildlife and the people for the survival of both. So oftentimes as a wildlife manager, this is kind of what our jobs look like. It can look a lot like a referee, trying to keep everyone in check, following the rules, and keeping it as fair and safe as possible for everyone, people and wildlife alike. But as you can probably imagine, and like I said earlier, people are often the hardest ones to manage. It's a hard balance. So that's where we find our human-wildlife conflicts, our human-bear conflicts, and any of those negative human-wildlife interactions that could come along when either the humans or wildlife spill over into the other side. So it's our job as wildlife managers to kind of create that line of separation with just enough overlap. Because we all want wildlife here, but we all have to figure out how to live in coexistence with them. And we all want different things from our wildlife experiences as well. And that's what we call different stakeholder groups. So some people might want more bears in their area just so they can have a better chance at viewing them and appreciating them from a distance. Some people might want less bears in their area because they're either scared of them or they're experiencing serious property damage done because of them. A lot of times you see this with farmers. You know, they depend heavily on their farming for their livelihood, and they think there's too many bears. Some people just want to help maintain their wild habitat in a way that can help preserve the species as a whole. So here you can see some of our litter task force volunteers cleaning up garbage. And some people view the bear as a very important game animal, just like deer or turkey. And all of those licenses do help support the conservation of bears in a huge way. And lastly, bears might be important for some scientific advancements and research. And you'll see here I have a picture of Coy working on his master's project. So bears were definitely a huge importance to him in his graduate study. So those are some of just the main stakeholder categories I could think of. I'm sure there are a lot more. And I want you guys to take a second and think about which category you might fall under. Feel free to comment below. And many of you might fall under multiple categories, and that's completely normal. So here we have a picture of two people yelling at each other, and that's just to show that everyone has a different mindset of how wildlife should be managed. So these two people might be neighbors. They might experience the exact same number of bears in their yard, but one of them thinks there's way too many bears, and one of them thinks there's not enough. And so there's all these different ideas and wants and expectations of how they think bear populations near them should be managed. And that is why we base a lot and most of all of our management decisions on science. This is something we can prove that works and is sustainable for both populations. But sometimes even the best science doesn't help manage things perfectly, and we'll hit on that a little bit later. All right, so next I have a little clip, a wildlife education video from the Idaho Fish and Game, and it's going to introduce us to this word carrying capacity and how that has an impact on how many bears, for example, or how many other wildlife species can be supported in a habitat versus how many people can handle having around.
One thing we do know is that this river has the carrying capacity to hold a lot more of these fish. Well, back to work for me.
Goodbye, Mr. Patterson. Thank you.
Come on, you guys, let's go.
Carrying capacity. What's that?
Carrying capacity. All habitat has carrying capacity. It's the number of animals that a habitat can carry. You all know what habitat is, don't you?
Food, water, shelter, and space. We've known that forever, Dad.
Well, good. Mr. Patterson knows from his research that this river has not reached its carrying capacity yet. At one time, there used to be a lot more fish here. We're trying to manage it so there'll be more salmon here again.
Can you have too many salmon or other animals for the habitat?
Sure. Sometimes wildlife can go over its carrying capacity. Hey, how much water could you put in this bucket?
A bucket full.
So what happens when you begin to fill it past the bucket full?
It overflows everywhere.
Okay, well, a habitat with too much wildlife can overflow too.
What happens to the overflowing animals?
Well, if they don't get enough food, water, shelter, or space, they may die.
All right, so as you could hear there, that word carrying capacity, I'm going to break it down now a little bit for you into how wildlife managers view that word for management. So we have carrying capacity as a whole, but we also have two parts to that. So our first part is that biological carrying capacity, and that's how much a habitat or an area of land can actually hold. So how many animals of a species it can actually hold based on the food, water, shelter, and space availability. So based on those resource availabilities. But then remember I talked about how we have to take people into consideration too. So we have a second part to that carrying capacity, which we call our social or cultural carrying capacity. And that basically means how much people will tolerate. So for example, your yard might be able to have a biological carrying capacity of 25 deer. There's enough food, there's enough water, there's enough space to hold 25 deer. However, they're destroying your yard, they're eating everything out of your garden, and so your social carrying capacity for deer might be more like 10. And so that's where wildlife management has to really find that tricky balance, that sort of happy medium between the biological carrying capacity and social carrying capacity, where we want habitat to reach its population capacity, but we don't want to completely overflow our social carrying capacity. All right, so here we're going to do a little bit of math and just some graphing for all the kids out there. So if we have a multiplication and an increase in the human population, what do you think will then happen to the social carrying capacity of bears? It would decrease, right? So if there's more people, our social carrying capacity would decrease. We don't want, we don't want bears walking next to our McDonald's drive-thru. There's less room for those bears as there's more people. Now, what about the bear's biological carrying capacity? I'm going to give you 1 second to take a guess here what that would mean for their biological carrying capacity. So that might just stay the same, right? Assuming a human population increase isn't taking over a bunch of the same land and resources that the bears would need, it could hypothetically stay steady. So their biological carrying capacity, or what the habitat can hold, could continue to stay the same. However, it could also mean a decline. As human populations increase, more of the bear's habitat could be being used by people, and that would in turn lose some of their biological carrying capacity as well. So technically it's possible that the land could hold more bears, but because of the amount of people, their population numbers might either be held steady or could lower at a biological capacity. All right, so now what if the human population decreases, or we have a subtraction to the amount of people? And for all the kids out there, or adults too, this is the time I'll give you a second to draw what you would think would happen to the social and biological carrying capacities of bear species if human populations were to decrease. So the social carrying capacity would increase because less people means less run-ins and conflict with bears, whether that's on trails, nuisance bears, property damages, etc. And same as earlier, the biological could be argued either way. So it could either increase because less people means less urbanization of their habitats, more space for the bears, or if they could stay about the same. So how do we as wildlife managers figure out these numbers in order to be able to properly manage bears and people? And the answer is research. That's why research is so important. And here's another little clip from that same Idaho Fish and Game Kids program that explains that really, really well.
That's why research is so important. We can't afford to guess about wildlife. I wouldn't want to guess about wildlife any more than I would about my own health. If you were sick, you wouldn't want the doctor to guess what was wrong with you, would you?
Heck no. That's why they go to school for a bazillion years, so they don't have to.
Wildlife managers have had a lot of training and a bazillion years of college and experience. They feel just as responsible about wildlife as a doctor does about your health.
So with all this research going on, wildlife management must be pretty easy, right?
Research is never easy, as you discovered with the mule deer. But science isn't the hardest part anymore. It's people.
I've got a few tools along. I think I can fix this.
Great.
What do you mean, people?
Well, for one thing, we have a lot more people than we used to, and that's going to affect habitat. As human populations grow, they replace wildlife habitat with human habitat. We need habitat for both wildlife and humans, but somehow we have to find a balance.
All right, so like you just heard on there, we need to find a balance. So we need to maintain habitat for both people and bears. And once we know those numbers for both social capacities and biological carrying capacities, we have to be able to manage and find that balance in coexistence. And there's a lot of research in human-bear coexistence happening all the time. There's actually a pretty new field within wildlife management called human dimensions that looks solely at these human-wildlife interfaces and how they interact. And the best way for us to manage for coexistence successfully is to first gauge humans' perspectives of bears or other wildlife species and figure out what they actually want from their bear population, varying from state to state. So remember those stakeholder slides earlier and how everybody might want bears for different reasons, or some people might think we have too many, or some people might think we have too few. The best way to figure out the general consensus is surveys and more research. So the next few slides were taken from a presentation at a Human Dimensions Bear-Human Conflict Workshop in 2018, the 5th International. And the ones I'm going to show you do have some statistics for Tennessee, which is why I included them, and they're pretty interesting. So this first one, the question that they asked people in general, do you support or oppose having black bears in your state? And you can see there in the bottom the different states. Tennessee's there in red, and you can see for Tennessee 57% strongly supported having black bears in the state, which is great, right? And then same here, strongly oppose, only 3%. So you can see the general consensus is that people in the state of Tennessee support having black bear populations here. All right, this next one says, which of the following statements best describes your feelings about black bears around your primary home and in your area? And it's kind of small, but you can see there Tennessee's in the green, and these are the different statements. And as I read these, I want you guys to think about how these apply to you and what you would answer. So first is, I want to see and have black bears in my yard / at my residence. I want to see and have black bears in my neighborhood, but not in my yard or at my residence. I want to see and have black bears in my county, parish, city, or town, but not in my neighborhood. I feel uncomfortable about having black bears even in my county, city, or town. Or the last one, none of these. And you can see for this one, the highest percentage, at least for my state of Tennessee, 50%, I want to see and have black bears in my county, city, or town, but not in my neighborhood. And so as you can imagine, that's pretty hard, right? Us as wildlife managers can't go out and tell all the bears to stay in the national park and, look pretty for the tourists, but don't ever wander into someone's neighborhood. It doesn't work like that. They don't listen to us like that. So it's really, really hard to find that balanced population number that keeps the bears at a happy medium where there's not too many overrunning into your neighborhoods, but also enough out there to continue on the population as a whole. So it's kind of a classic case of you can't have your cake and eat it too, but oftentimes for wildlife species, that's what a lot of the public wants to see. So our next one is, of those who said they had a problem with bears, the percent saying that bears cause the following problems. And as you can see, none of these are a surprise to you guys, right? Number one is garbage. Number two is their presence in general, and that just might be because people aren't aware or, are worried about safety reasons or don't know if they should be scared of them. Structural damage, agricultural damage, threat to humans is only 5%, yards, pets, and as you can see, it just go down from there. So that top one is garbage, nuisance bears and garbage, and we've hit on this so many times in many of our other kids programs, and you guys all know too. But that's where one of the greatest things is you guys watching this, and that can help spread the word about how serious that garbage problem is for wild bears. All right, and the last one here, when asked if they feel that the most problems caused by bears can be resolved through preventative measures, such as using bear-proof garbage containers in areas that are frequented by bears, we had an overwhelming amount of people, 74% of Tennessee residents, said that they strongly support this. So that shows that people know that the bears can be managed in a sustainable way, and that's a really, really good sign. So 84% on average people agreed that bear problems can be resolved by these preventative measures. So that kind of leaves managers, right? Where do we go from here? We know people want to see bears, but they don't want to see too many bears. They know the problem. A lot of the problem relates to trash. So where do we go from there? How do we manage both the people and the wildlife? And that's what I just said to you guys, how it's such great that you guys are watching this and you can help spread the word, because more education is truly the best way to get out there and do that. And one of the best organizations that does that here in the Southeast is Bearwise. If you haven't heard of them, I strongly encourage going to look at www.bearwise.org. This is a southeastern mindset that's home to more than 72,000 black bears here in the area. You can see the map there. Trying to share a space with more than 124 million people. So you can just imagine all those different dilemmas we just looked at, different feelings from people, how they want them, but they also don't want them too close, and how that can be a really hard balance. So Bearwise helps people live responsibly with bears. If you go to their website, they cover a lot of the things that we've talked about: bear-proof trash cans, storing your bird feeders. They also have a lot of kids activities and coloring sheets, but also tell you how to get your community involved and become a Bearwise community. So you can actually get your community registered if you live in a neighborhood or some sort of community that would like to be involved in this. If you go to bearwise.org, you can become a part of that and be an actual certified Bearwise community. And the more of those we have, the better it'll be, because if we just have community and community and community, we need them all to be kind of connected in order to create the best habitat for coexistence. So just remember, as bear and human populations continue to grow and multiply, we still must maintain some sort of divide between the two so that we can both live safely and sustainably. And that is how we get our successful wildlife management. So that's all for our Facebook Live today. I know it was a little bit shorter, but that one had a little less of bear videos we could show, which is a good thing. We don't want to show a lot of videos of bears and humans together because we don't want bears and humans to be that close. And again, just a reminder, we have 2 more of these classes left. We have next week on Tuesday and then the following week. Next week we'll be covering Appalachian Bear Rescue, our care here for injured and orphaned bears, and then our last one will be bears of the world. So we'll talk all about the different bear species around the globe, and so that'll be really interesting to get to compare everything we've learned about black bears through this kids series to other bears of the world. So thank you guys so much again for signing on. This is Curator Tori, and thank you so much to all who donated. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned a little bit of something about humans, bears, and habitat, and I will see you next week.